At our action evening tonight. And we have our guest, Chris Sorio, and he's going to teach us about migrant worker rights. So first, I'm going to just give a little bit of a land acknowledgement, as we all like to do. So we're coming together today on many unceded lands that were stolen from the different Coast Salish peoples. I'm in Richmond, the lands of Kwantlen, Stolo, Tsawwassen, Katzie, and the Unitarian Center is located on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh peoples. They took care of the land so it, along with the plants, fish, and animals, could nourish them and their cultures. The legacy of colonialism, which robbed these Coast Salish peoples of this rich inheritance, continues to this day. Let us be motivated to develop new relationships of respect, love, and stewardship that honors their past and ongoing inheritance. So our guest presenter is Chris Sorio. He's the vice chairperson of Migrant BC. Migrant workers face many difficulties when they go abroad: low wages, which barely cover remittances that they send home to help their families, difficult working conditions, and unpaid or invisible overtime, in addition to emotional suffering and loneliness from family separation. So we're going to learn more and hear stories from Chris and his first-hand experience with this. So welcome, Chris. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me in your tonight's education evening. It's a pleasure to join you in this time of socially distant learning and sharing. I'm going to start with sharing first my story of migration. So to put in context the passion that I have in fighting for migrant rights. My uncle actually came here in the 1960s as professional Filipinos who moved from the US to Canada. And at the time, my uncle actually described to me, and I was around 6 years old at the time, when he said, Canada is that country up north of the United States where the Americans are running away, who does not want to work or fight for the Vietnam War goes. They are called the drop dodgers. That's how I remember Canada. The Canada that I know when I was a young person was the peace-loving Canada. That's why the Americans sought a safe haven here. And I will never forget that. So I came in Canada with my 4 kids, and my family arrived here in 1989. And we landed in Toronto. That was my port of entry. From there, with almost several years now of living here and almost close to retirement, I now live here in Richmond, British Columbia. So from Ontario, moved to Alberta, and now here. It gets closer to the water, from Ontario. Now I'm closer to the Pacific Ocean. It's now closer to like 14 hours of travel time to the Philippines instead of 24 hours of flying to the Philippines. But I came here in 1989 when Canada, at that time, I don't know if people remember the word desktop publishing. When corporations needed graphic designers who knows computer to be able to design pamphlets, magazines, and printing. So because I come from the printing background. And I work not as an activist. The work that I do as an activist is a passion and volunteer work that I do after working 8 hours for a capitalist corporation. So I need to have a job so that I can have the energy to fight capitalism, because that's the only way we can survive. But nowadays, when I look at it, people are arriving in Canada not like the way I was able to come. They're arriving in Canada not with their families. Sometimes some of them would take 10 years before they can even have what we call a reunification of their families. So some of them have become strangers to their own family. We have several movies that I will share the links to you at the end. It's called like When Strangers Reunite. So the the face of migration now has changed. We have more people arriving in Canada, temporary, meaning their work and their stay in Canada is tied up to a single employer. The loss of that employer could also mean the loss of their housing accommodation. So it's not only uh, losing a job, it's also trying to find out where you're going to live once you have no more employer. That's the case of the caregivers, that's the case of the farm workers that we know of here in British Columbia. You know, in the lower mainland, we have an abundance of berry farms and other orchards that benefits mostly from the work of migrant workers. Um, my organization is called Migrante BC. We're just a chapter of more than 200 chapters of Migrante International spread globally. We started organizing in the 80s when we realized that the labor export program of our Philippine government was meant to be able to move people out of the country rather than produce jobs that can help sustain and support families. So that is the reason why we have a lot of migrants leaving the country, right? That's called an export policy program. Our unemployment is widespread. We have low wages and precarious jobs, which are the main reasons why Filipinos leave the country. And when I say leave the country, at present there are 6,000 Filipinos leaving the country every day. Approximately 10% of our population is outside of the Philippines. Unemployment and underemployment is estimated to be around 30%, with nearly 40% of those jobs are part-time, mostly low-paying and insecure jobs, which is a very good description of precarious work. 7 in 10 peasants or farmers does not own the land that they till. So combined with our inability of a national economy that does not have national industrialization that could provide decent jobs for families and the inability of farmers to own the land that they till, people have opted to leave the country and work abroad. Our legislated minimum wage is very low, which is roughly 43% of what you earn cannot even support the needs of a family of 6. We in Migrante BC have several goals. We want to educate, organize, and mobilize overseas Filipinos on the issues of migrants and link this issue of the Filipino people for their ability to fight for their rights. That is one thing that differentiates us from other what you call community groups, because most of the migrant advocates only advocate for your rights and well-being or your conditions here, whereas we, Migrante, we want to address the root cause of why people are leaving the country, because without addressing that, we can only be always doing a first aid or a short-term solution, band-aid solution, rather than addressing the root cause of restlessness, unemployment in our country. And we do this kind of work to awareness raising, organizing migrants to educational activities such as workshops, speaking to groups like what we're doing tonight, in order to do our educational work. We conduct also research. That's why we partner with the universities. We partner with the government researches, with the Canadian policy for different kinds of research to be able to address issues of unemployment, paid sick days, things like that, right? So, and we look at it now in the period of pandemic, because approximately a year ago is when we all have been surprised by this, and I mean it shows up in my memory yesterday that I was wearing the mask and the goggles already a year ago. So that was the signal of our pandemic lockdown when we started observing all the health restrictions and social distancing. A major activity of Migrante is to conduct campaigns that support the rights and welfare of migrant workers and to raise the profile of migrant issues to a broader Canadian public. We lead campaigns to address the root cause of migration, like I mentioned earlier, including human rights violations in the country where I come from, or anti-people development policies, including the operations of Canadian mining corporations abroad and the militarization that is being used by governments to be able to prevent people's resistance. We look at this as an integral component of our work. We do not separate this. We build solidarity linkages and networks with the interfaith groups like your group tonight. I hope we could this can be a long-lasting relationship building that we can embark on it once you learn more about us and start supporting our campaigns. This is it is an important part of the work that we do. Migrante BC is part of Migrante Canada. We have around 17 organizations of Filipino organizations across Canada: Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, in the Maritimes, and also here in British Columbia. I am not only the Vice Chair of Migrante BC, I am also the National Secretary General of Migrante Canada. As such, part of the work that I do is always to make presentations and bring forward the issues of our country, of the migrant workers as well. So years ago, a lot of the migrants arriving from our country, the Philippines, would be caregivers. British Columbia is the second largest province of Canada that receives migrant workers. And right now, there's only like less than 800 caregivers arriving in Canada, which is destined to British Columbia. A lot of the migrant workers arriving are working in the farms, working in the meat industry. Very recently, I met butchers or meat cutters, as the Canadians would call them, rather than butchers, who works here in the Lower Mainland because there's a big need of the Canadian meat industry for meat cutters that have high skill. And most of the migrant workers arriving are coming into different programs. It's not anymore before, during my time wherein you come here, you can bring your family. Most of them are arriving under the temporary foreign worker program that their stay or their employment is tied up with a single employer. The loss of that job means that they have to get another work permit to be able to find an employer. And in case they could not find one, they end up or risk going into what we call a situation of undocumented. They become undocumented. Migrante has campaigns on the regularization of migrant workers. And when we say regularizations, meaning when you become undocumented, the language that the migrants or the immigration use is irregular migrants. That's why the counterpart of that would be to regularize their status. And there are several campaigns that groups are doing, because Migrante is not alone in this. We are part of the Migrant Rights Network, which is a network of migrant advocates across Canada that will be meeting this Sunday to once again affirm our commitment to campaign to the Canadian Parliament, not only to the federal, but also to the provincial, on the need to provide a landed status for all migrants. A lot of our groups demand that this landed status should be provided upon arrival, because years ago, when Canada was in need of women caregivers coming from Europe, they were provided landed status. But as the color of migration changes, that landed status pathway has become narrower and narrower, that even in a single file, none of us might not be able to fit in the trail or pathway for permanent residency. So those are the things that we do. And like I said, I think it's important that when we understand migration, we look at the receiving country, which is Canada. How does Canada benefits from this? Why is it now temporary more than permanent? Although the needs and jobs that we see are permanent, yet the workers that they place are temporary. And then the countries like the Philippines or in the Latin Americas that have been sending workers here for several years now that have no pathways for permanent residency, just like the farmers or the farm workers under the seasonal agricultural worker program. These are the Mexican or Latino workers that you see working in the farms in Delta, in Kelowna, that comes here for 8 months and go back home. And next year, they hope to get another contract so that they can continue coming. Those are the kind of phases of migration that we see nowadays. And what does it mean for all of us? What it means is that in Canada, we have two tiers or levels of rights. The rights of workers who have permanent and citizenship, and the rights of workers who are temporary, who actually have an absence of rights more than a presence of rights. When I say absence, it's because although we have unemployment standards in the different provinces, and although the immigration has provisions that their rights should be respected by their employers, the migrant workers are afraid to speak up because they know that when they speak, it means that they might lose their job. We have seen farmers or farm workers who've been let go, accused of violating COVID protocols just because they interacted with the people in public. We have cases of an outbreaks of COVID in the farms because of the housing conditions that they live in. How does one do quarantine for 14 days when in fact you're expected to work during those times? That's why part of our campaign as well is also paid sick days. How many of you have paid sick days at work? There you go. And how many have, you know, and how many does not have that, right? The BC government said, yes, we can have legislated sick days, but not paid. You can take time off and not lose your job, but we know that if you are not getting paid, but you need that money, you would come to work even though you're sick. And because of that, especially in the time of pandemic, that's a risk that people would take, right? I know today, as we talk about vaccination program, we just launched yesterday our appeal to the federal government to not forget the migrant workers, because throughout this period of pandemic, there was so much praise for frontline workers, essential workers, and recognition that the migrants are doing this essential work. Yet, they're always left behind. When we all said, we always hear this, we are all in this together. And the reality is, we are not, because some or most of the migrant workers are not in this with us. And that's, I think, an important thing that we need to remember if we want to advocate for the migrant workers is they do not have rights. They do not have access to services. And we don't even know if they will have access to vaccines, right? So those are the challenges in the pandemic. We hear our leaders saying we need a reset. A new social order is what we need. One wherein social justice becomes the centerpiece of anyone's government rather than profit, right? Healthcare for all, social services for all. We have seen that. Imagine years ago when we say that our minimum wage should be up, corporation said no. We said we need paid sick days, corporation said no. But now what do we hear? You must have paid sick days because if you go to work and sick, you can spread the COVID virus. So I think with that, I'd rather leave some time for questions, answers, and have a discussion on how we can work together to be able to advocate for the rights of migrants, because after all, the rights of migrants are the rights of workers, and the rights of workers are the human rights. So thank you once again for inviting me to your group tonight.
Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. We're going to take, your timing is perfect. We're going to take some questions now, and Catherine's going to facilitate the questions. And then just to give people a little bit of the shape of the day, we'll go on until just 2 minutes or so before 8 o'clock. And then generally what we do is we take a 2-minute break just to have those people that need to get going. We can say a farewell to them and send them off for the evening and thank everybody for coming. And then those people that want to continue with more questions can go up until 8:30, but we always close it down by 8:30. So I'm going to pass it over to Catherine to facilitate some questions for you at this time. Thank you so much.
So I just noticed that we have posted in the chat 3 different contacts. So
yes, I posted those are the ones that Chris was talking about. I put them in the chat for everybody. Thank you for pointing that out. One is the Facebook connection, and then the Migrant BC and the Migrant Canada are those organizations that you mentioned.
So you can pay attention to those, or can we save those? Will they come up in?
Yeah, I'll be adding them as well. Like we, as many people know, but some may not, we will be saving this onto a YouTube, and then the links and more information will be in the description below the YouTube on our UCV Action Evening playlist of the various action evenings. So yes, those will be available later.
So I would suggest if you want to type a question into the chat, that's just fine. But I think the group is of a size that we can just manage with people just indicating by putting their hand up. And I'll take notes of who has their hands up soon, and first, and try to accommodate people in the order that they put their hand up. I see Karen has put a question already. She says, Chris, you mentioned connection with universities. Do you know if there is any research currently going on for exposure to pesticides?
That's a good question. Actually, what I will do is, personally, I don't know of any research, but we have links with our groups, the Justicia for migrant workers, the Sanctuary Health. What I will do is connect with them right away and send you any references to your group. So I will be sending that through Cindy regarding that, because we have periodic reports coming from the farm workers groups regarding this. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I guess I have a question, Chris. You would be familiar with the history of this in Canada, and I'm not. Why did we change the system? Was there some underlying industrial reason for changing the system from bringing families who would then eventually integrate, and changing that to making the work available only to temporary workers? I mean,
The changes actually once when you look at 100 years of history of Canadian immigration is let's go back to the Chinese railroad workers, right? At the time, mostly men, and they were not even prevented to bring their families, and they were paying at that time $500 to be able to come here. So it's uh, periodically, and I think in certain periods of our history, we have seen policies that would put a single group of people, segregate them, and provide a different set of policies for them. I think a walk into the Steveston Cannery area would have a reminder of that when you see how you have the Chinese bunkhouse and you have the Murakami house, you know. So periodically it changes, right? But the big shift but from permanent to temporary happened in 2012, I believe, wherein Canada have allowed the entry of more temporary workers. We used to call the migrants before as a reserve labor, meaning these are the people who would be offered less money rather than pay the Canadians to do this job, right? That's one reason. Second is we call them the disposable workforce because when they're not needed, rather than they can collect EI, just like most of us, they cannot collect EI and therefore has to leave the country. Although in their period of employment here, Canada has been collecting CPP, EI, to benefits, right? That they can't even access, right? So look at that way, you know, and then uh, the from the conservative and the liberal government, they keep is always finger pointing. Oh yeah, we will provide landed status, but it has to be temporary. There must be a certain pathways, and we said the problem with your pathways is that they're so narrow now that even I think most of us here who speaks English will not even pass the language tests that they have been applying. We have met migrant workers who have lost their status because they failed the language tests, although they've been working here.
Mm.
We have seen and met women under the live-in caregiver who were asked to go home after working for several years here because they contracted cancer in Canada and they've been determined to be a burden to the Canadian healthcare system, right? It reminds me of the story of Juana Tiada, a caregiver who got cancer here, and then she was asked to go home, and we fought for her. That's why there was a loan named after her. And we always say, migrants have been coming here in good health. If you got sick here, why are we sending them home? Right? The farm workers who've been exposed to pesticides, if they got sickness, they can be repatriated back to their country. Right? So that's what's happening. And it's all in the context of neoliberal policies. Right? It's not only Canada who's doing it. That's why we said it's important that we look at the root cause of migration, meaning how countries like Canada exploits countries of the South. You know, we look at the global North versus the global South. And that's why as we fight for the rights of migrants, let's also understand the socio-economic conditions of the countries where they're coming from to be able to have an understanding of the need for social change.
Kirsten, and then Tamiko, did you put your hand up? No. Okay, Kirsten, you had something to say.
I've been reading up on this a bit with Robin Maynard's book, on policing Black lives goes over, she has a whole chapter on immigration and on the caregivers and migrant workers. There's a long history of bringing people from the global south, from the Caribbean, from the Philippines as caregivers and without full rights or without landed status.
Yeah, that's very true. That's why part of the a big component of our work is in the employment standards,
Mhm.
right? To be able to advocate, because without their rights at work, it would be hard to protect workers, right? And we know that in some workplaces, people don't even realize they're working with migrant workers. Nobody knows, right? I work with some in my company, wherein some of them are temporary workers coming from Italy, from Ireland, and the same. No, it doesn't really matter whether you're black or white or yellow or brown. Under this program, if your program is temporary, your chances of staying in Canada permanently is very narrow. And yeah, they send them home. Years ago, we have the under the Kenny administration. I mean, during the conservative time, they have this 4-year rule, 4 year in, 4 year out, and what it means is after working for 4 years here, whether your employer like to renew you, you have to leave Canada. That law or that rule was finally lifted by the Liberal government when Trudeau came into power. That's one victory that we fought for. And one of our researchers, one of the academic researchers who spoke to the immigration, they asked this question: why did you make that rule? Why did you suggest that rule? And they said it was hard for them to determine whether these people would stay or would leave. So they just decided randomly that 4 is a good number, and after 4 years you must leave the country, regardless whether employers need you or not. And I saw that firsthand when I live in Jasper, Alberta. For 3 years, I lived, I worked, and I married a temporary foreign worker. I saw how it put their lives in what you call limbo, right? I've seen workers who've been sent home, working after 7 years working as a chef in Jasper, Alberta, to be sent home because he failed one aspect of the language test. It does not have any reflection on his ability to cook eggs and make egg sandwich. And I think you made also a good point about border security. Because when you look at it right now, a lot of countries are relying on the Israeli model of border enforcement and security system, applying it in the borders of the United States, applying it in other countries, just because of how they have become expert in preventing the movement of the Palestinian people. So we have seen that. We have seen a growing role. Our partners in the United States have reported that a lot of the training and a lot of the procedures now put in place in the U.S. borders are mostly modeled after the Israeli system.
Oh, good. Mm. Oh,
I see Michelle has her hand up.
sorry, I missed that. Yvonne, go ahead. Or Michelle, sorry.
Yeah. Hello, thanks for the presentation. So you talked a little bit about the campaigns that you're working on to get landed status for migrant workers, and I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about how that campaign's going, how like politicians are responding, and how like other groups can support in those calls.
Thank you. Thank you for raising that, Michelle. There are several campaigns under the landed status. Some call them amnesty. One group here in BC call it amnesty for migrant workers. Some call it regularization. And a big group of us have the status for all campaign, right? So we start with the situation that how workers lose their status. Most workers come here legally, but the policies of the immigration program or the immigration ministry results into that pulling out of status, especially during the time of pandemic, wherein the processing of your papers have become very slow. Not only here in Canada, but even the required papers that you need from your country of origin have made it impossible for them to be able to meet deadlines. That's one reason. Second would be you're victim of labor traffickers or recruiters who misrepresent you, promise you jobs. We've seen mushroom corporations promising that they can have landed status. Or I've met also worm pickers in London, Ontario, who are promised that they can become landed status, although there is no program for landed status for worm pickers. So those are reasons that could force people to lose their status. And because of that, you have no rights at all in Canada. One estimate of the population of undocumented workers across Canada would be in the range of 200,000 to 500,000. It is very hard to estimate just because nobody is tracking it, right? And I say always undocumented workers because they're actually here to work and they're actually paid by corporations, by companies to work. So they're not really a burden. In fact, they pay taxes when they buy at Shoppers Drug Mart or London Drugs or go to Zara or go to Lululemon. They pay taxes through the provincial tax and GST. So because of that, we have campaigns too that Canada should allow the workers to have a regular status. Some of us also ask that if regular status cannot be provided right away, provide them with work permits. So you'll see different groups advocating for this, but of course the majority is, why don't you just give them status now? Because the government, especially since last year, have been doing different kinds of regular, what we call a semblance of regularization program by saying, no, there will not be deportation right now. We will have a certain program for international students so that they don't need to leave Canada. We have seen farm workers who have been allowed to stay here because in a few weeks, the planting season will start. In a few weeks or in a few months, if we don't have farm workers, we will not be having berries to eat during the springtime, right? So there are different measures being done by the government. The meat industry, which is a very powerful lobby industry, has advocated and actually won a very good program they call the pilot program for agri-food industry, wherein after working as 1 year in a meat corporation or a poultry farm, they can apply for landed status. I met 9 of them last December, and next month they look forward to applying to become permanent residents of Canada, and you could just see the smile in their face. So while we have a group of people who can apply in 1 year, we have a big number of people who have been waiting for 10 years to bring their family into Canada. And they are the people who care for the kids, care for our sick and elderly, yet they cannot care for their family here in Canada. That's why our campaigns is like, landed status now, develop regularization programs so that all these workers can have access to healthcare, social services, vaccines, employment insurance, and of course, provide them pathways for citizenship because they are already here working and not a burden to Canadian society. We will send you the links to that at the end of this presentation. I promise Cindy to send an email of my text of presentation and the different campaigns, because on Sunday, we will once again launch our commitment for landed status for all migrant workers. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading more about the campaigns. Thanks so much.
I'm going to just make a comment. I ride the bus. I hear lots of people speaking Tagalog and speaking Spanish, and I always assume that they are permanent workers, that they are here, that they are going to be, that they will at some point be applying for citizenship. So what proportion of the people who are actually working here and obviously have come from other places, what proportion of them do have status?
That would be hard number. Like as I mentioned to you, the estimate of 200,000 to 500,000 undocumented workers across Canada. It's a big number. Yeah. And that number is the number I gave the city of Toronto years ago. That was years ago. And what's happening now is periodically the CBSA, or the Canadian Border Authorities, would be conducting raids, conducting arrests and deportation. Every year they have a goal, a certain number in mind. So people, sometimes you could, if you fail to fulfill all the requirements in your application, you could be deemed not eligible to stay in Canada, and therefore you must leave Canada. So we have several situations here that results into that. So it's very hard number to guess, right? But what we have seen is, I think, what's important to remember is we know that the jobs that the people do here, some of them might be seasonal, but they are always in need of workers. There are permanent needs, but the workers are always in temporary, right? And that's a question that we ask, is that if the jobs are permanent, why are the workers not permanent?
I have a question. Thanks. So the concept of the recruiters or the contractors, is that across Canada? So it would be the same in British Columbia as it is in Saskatchewan or Ontario?
Yes,
how does that work? Tell us more about that, because I don't
Okay.
think we know much about that.
Yeah. So the country like the Philippines have banned what we call direct recruitment. Meaning, even if an employer wants to hire me to come to Canada, I can't deal with an employer. I have to go through a recruitment agency, or Tim Hortons would have to hire an employment agency, say, I want you to recruit 50 workers from the Philippines to work in our different locations. That's what we have seen. That's one aspect. Some countries, they do it as the country itself, the government itself is the contractor. That's the case of the seasonal agricultural workers, wherein the government of Mexico is negotiating with the government of Canada. Give us more spots. Make sure you give us a spot for 10,000 workers or 5,000 workers. It becomes, look at it as modern day slavery. It's a big slave trade market, right? That's one aspect of the recruitment. Although the Canadian immigration policies have always said very clearly that nobody should be paying recruiters, employers can also pay recruiters, right? We have, I think, if you're a corporation, you don't call it labor recruiter, you call them labor headhunters, right? But corporations will say, I need some workers to come from this country. Can you look for it and find it for me? Right? So yeah, there are different ways wherein how people are coming in. It's similar to an employment agency. If we can find permanent work, we go to an employment agency. They're not supposed to pay, but they have to pay, especially if you're coming from a country like the Philippines. If I really want to live and provide an income for my family, I'd rather pay this labor recruiter so much money to be able to find a job in Canada. And when I say pay, you are looking at least $10,000. $10,000. Some workers have come to Canada with a promise of permanent residency, paying $10,000, only to find out that it would take them a long time to even get that money back, 10,000. That's why we have this campaign on recruitment. We have a very good policy here in the British Columbia. We are always proud of the temporary foreign registry program that was implemented under the NDP government. Although it's a step in the right direction, it actually falls short because it took them 3 years to implement it. That's why we're always knocking at the doors of Harry Baines, the labor minister, saying, what you're doing is not enough. If you want to protect workers, you must also have labor inspectors who have the perspective of migrant workers more than the perspective of an employer, right? Yeah, so the role of an employer plays is very big. In Leamington, Ontario, wherein it is our tomato capital, one employer is one labor recruiter is like the god in that town of Leamington. He can go to the CEO of the company and say, I want that worker to go home now and don't give her a permit anymore. Do not renew her permit. We have videos of that was shown on TBO. And I'll try to look for that link and send it to everybody. Or you could hear the employer saying, no, you got to go. That is the power of a recruiter in this country. And question is, how come it's allowed, right? I mean, if any of these recruiters are found guilty, and which we have in BC, Leticia Sarmiento was the first acknowledged victim of labor trafficking in British Columbia and Canada. And yet the power of the law and the employers was able to make it hard for her to be able to assert her rights, right? So it's amazing, right? And that's why we always say, these workers needs better protection.
Thank you.
Mark, yes.
I was just thinking that this seems to coincide with probably the last, I don't know, it's probably more years than I'm thinking, but at least 30 years that more and more corporations, whether they're hiring unskilled Canadian-born labor or immigrant labor, are seldom providing full-time jobs. It's more and more part-time jobs where you have people working 2 or 3 jobs so that they don't have to pay benefits. And it seems like it has a lot to do with that corporate structure and the weakness of unions, just a lot of social things. And probably the migrant workers have paid the biggest price on that, but a lot of employed people are really poorly employed in the last 20, 30 years with changes in corporations, I think.
That's very true. That's very true. And I'm glad you spoke about labor unions because we've partnered with labor unions. We've been doing advocacy together with labor unions. And in fact, more than 10 years ago, the steelworkers in Ontario, we embarked on a unionizing campaign of caregivers. We have the Immigrant Workers Association home section, which is patterned after the taxi drivers union. wherein we try to organize the caregivers, the domestic workers. It was a short campaign, but I think it's important that to be able to extend trade union or labor rights and the support of the labor union is important. We partner with them, especially on most campaigns, paid sick days, the landed status. But it's, I think, important that we start organizing and unionizing them. The meat workers I met in Langley, they are in a unionized workplace. GFCW local, I think 18 is the union that is helping them out. In Manitoba, part of the collective bargaining agreement, they were able to win several years ago a provision wherein the union and the management of the corporation must put resources together to be able to help these temporary workers, assist them in their application for their landed status, and to make sure that if they need to be laid off, that there is provision to help them stay in Canada. It's a landmark collective bargaining agreement that I've reminded our partners in Manitoba to pay attention and make sure we take hold of that victory and do not lose that language in the bargaining agreement. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. I think it's important that one must look at it. We call it precarious workers. A lot of us are precarious workers, but because we are citizens and residents of this country, we can just quit a job, find another job, or like work 3 jobs. But the precarity of the condition of migrant workers is different because they can only work with one employer. They can only have one job. So they get paid less, they have less rights, and their stay is in relation to their worker status. I can go on all night just talking about landed, migrant workers and how they're exploited, not only in this country. I always I'm so fortunate to be able to share that with you tonight. I think that I really appreciate this night of sharing this, and I look forward to more sharing that we can do in the future and collaboration in supporting our campaigns. Because I think it's important that the Canadian public raise this through their MPs, to their MLAs, through the city governments. Migrante BC in 2019 was awarded by the City of Vancouver the Equity and Diversity Award. So we take pride in that kind of recognition. In December 2020, the City of Surrey, the City of Burnaby, the City of Vancouver, on December 18, 2020, declared International Migrants Day. That declaration is not only a declaration for one day, it is a recognition of their commitment to fight for the rights of migrant workers, and we will hold them accountable for that. And I think maybe Cindy and I in 2021 will work to ask that the City of Richmond declare December 18, 2021 as
Absolutely.
International Migrants Day.
Yeah, we need to.
I'm in Richmond too.
That's
Wonderful.
right.
There you go.
Campaign. So shall we take maybe a 2-minute break in case anybody needs to use the washroom? And then if anybody needs to go and their time is up for today, thank you all for coming. And as we said, this will be on the YouTube playlist for the action evenings available if you know of anybody that's interested and hasn't been able to attend tonight. But thank you all for coming and for your interest. And thank you so much for Chris. But we will stay open for another half hour after a 2-minute break if people want to continue with questions. I find the more you hear, the more questions start to pop up and you wonder about, well, what about this and what about that?